All right. Hello, everyone. We see everyone coming into the webinar now. Thank you all for being here. We'll get started shortly as people start to arrive. But thank you for spending a little time with us today to talk about all things community wealth building. All right, so for those who are just joining again, thank you for joining us. We'll get started shortly. In the meantime, if you don't mind just telling us maybe your name and what organization or organizations/entities you may be representing today, that may be helpful, just for context. So feel free to utilize the chat and just put name, organizations or entities that you're representing today. And then again, we'll get started shortly. Thank you.
Can you hear me? I can't hear you. You're being quiet.
This is the meditation moment.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
No, it's not.
Oh,
We're just waiting for folks to filter in. If you're just now joining us, please put your name and your affiliation and your location if you'd like to share it in the chat. It's nice to see folks from all over, including some of our practitioners from Baltimore and Chicago. We've got some folks from Scotland. Thanks everyone for joining. We'll get started in just a minute.
All right. Well, we've got a great crew. More people are joining, but welcome. Let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tadian Page, who's going to run us through today's show.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, so again, thank you all for being here today. In my part of the world, it is afternoon. So I'll say good afternoon from here in DC. As mentioned, my name is Tadian Page, and I have the pleasure of serving as a community wealth building fellow for the Democracy Collaborative. Been in this role for a little bit over 6-7 months now, really helping to advance this work around the country amongst some amazing colleagues that you'll meet throughout today's presentation. So again, thank you for giving us some of your time. We'll try to make good use of the next 90 minutes with you to really talk about the transformative potential of the growing CWB movement and what that looks like at a national, but also at a global landscape and perspective as well. To get us started, just to kind of set the intention for today, wanted to share the agenda. So of course, again, we'll kind of go through some introductions as those who serve as panelists and speakers today. As they come on screen, will introduce themselves. And then we'll kind of talk about the state of CWB as a whole and what that looks like nationally, but as I already mentioned, also from a global perspective. So my colleagues Sarah and Neil will kind of lead us through that presentation. And then after that, we really get to the practitioner piece of today's conversation. And we have three amazing panelists and speakers here with us from three different parts of the world to really highlight and showcase the amazing work that they're doing to advance community wealth building in their respective places. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but those three places for today that we'll be sharing are Atlanta, Georgia, St. Louis, Missouri, and then Denver, Colorado as well. So after those presentations, we'd like to open up the chat for you to be able to ask questions, get real feedback in real time around the struggles, but also some of the great things that are happening in your respective places or those lingering questions you may have so that we can assist in advancing that work in your respective places as well. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah, for some opening comments and remarks about the state of CWB and where we are as of today.
Great. Thank you so much, Tadian, and thank you to all of you for being here. My name is Sarah McKinley. I am the Director for Community Wealth Building Programs with the Democracy Collaborative, and we are a think do tank that advances research, advising, and support for places that are advancing a more democratic economy through community wealth building and other methods, including through research and other supports. So I'm just going to give a little opening framing of where community wealth building is from our perspective and where it's going. And then my colleague Neil will talk about what that looks like on a scale and moving forward. And as Tadian said, then we'll hear from practitioners in the US really digging into what it takes to do this work. I'm actually going to turn off my video to save bandwidth. I've been freezing in really awkward and uncomfortable positions for myself and everyone else, and I don't want to subject you or myself to that kind of humiliation. So I'm just going to pause my video so you can look at the slides as well. So thank you, Tadian, for the great slides. These will be shared with everyone as we move forward. So why are we talking about transforming our economy? Why is this important? We, of course, are in a decade of unprecedented crises, not least of which is our crisis in inequality and concentration of wealth. We have the highest concentrations of wealth that have ever been recorded in human history at this moment, where 5 men, and indeed they are men, own more than 46% of all of the world's wealth and all of the world's wealth generating assets. So what does this graph here show you? This is showing you the wage stagnation in the United States over the last 40 or more years. This is showing that labor's share of national income, so the wages that we are making as wage earners have declined, they've stagnated. In other words, having a job, having an income is not enough to grow wealth. The problem is not income. The problem is not jobs. The problem is wealth and wealth inequality, right? There is no shortage of wealth that we have created through our own labor, through our own assets, through our own resources. The problem is how it is getting to each of us and who is owning and controlling. This is a chart, by the way, from our recently released Index of Systemic Trends that's showing that trends like this, like wage stagnation in the United States, are continuing. They are not new. These declining statistics, these signs of crises have been ongoing for the last 40 or 50 years and are indicative of systemic and structural issues in the way that our economy operates. Next slide, please, Tayden. So what does this mean? Ownership of wealth generating assets is key, right? It is what defines our local economies, who owns it, who controls it, and then as a result, who benefits from it, right? So right now we're seeing that highly skewed in the hands of fewer and fewer people who have greater and greater control around our economy. So the goal is to change that, right? The goal is to create an economy where wealth is broadly held rather than concentrated and is locally rooted so that it's benefiting the people and the places that generate that wealth in the first place. It's benefiting people, place, and planet by design, right? The economy is something that we have created. A better economy is something that we can also create, one in service to ourselves, a place where we can define what it means to be wealthy and prosperous and thriving and not just being subject to the whims of a global economy. The goal is to address inequality head on, up front, and not after the fact. So that's what we're talking about. Next slide, please, Tadian. And that's what leads us to community wealth building. So what is community wealth building? It is many things. It is experimental, but at its heart, it is an economic development model. It is taking on the economy, the way we have developed the economy directly to transform local economies so that communities have greater direct ownership and control of their assets in place, so that communities are benefiting directly from that wealth that is concentrated away from us and is producing shared economic prosperity, racial equity, ecological sustainability, and greater equality by design. And that is what community wealth building offers. That's what it can do. So what does that look like? Next slide, please, Tadian. And just to say, this is part of a movement, right? Community wealth building acts in partnership with many movements for economic and social justice. And it grows out of that lineage from the civil rights movement to the cooperative economy movements in Canada, in Europe, in the global South, and it builds on those and articulates a framework to connect lots of these experimental and different ways of constructing economies. It grew out of Cleveland, Ohio. You may have heard of the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland, Ohio, which is a network of employee-owned cooperatives that first started articulating and viewing themselves as community wealth building. But it's grown since then, and it grew out of a recognition that traditional economic development that favors large corporations and subsidies to attract large corporations rather than building up our local assets, our local people, what we have already, that is not sufficient for creating regenerative and resilient economies where people have autonomy and agency within those economies. So the work in Cleveland was a beginning of an experiment to articulate different elements of cooperative ownership, progressive procurement, and other elements of community wealth building. And it's evolved since then. It's been practiced now in other places, translated to the United Kingdom, to Europe, to Scotland. You'll be hearing about that. And back to the United States, where we're learning and growing and evolving this practice. And it's being adopted in communities all over the world. And again, it's part of a global movement to build a more just economy from the ground up. Next slide, please. As I said, it's part of a number of movements that you've heard of: well-being economies, new municipalism, donut economics, solidarity economy, and just transition. Community wealth building knits into those frames, building up activities in the solidarity economy, building up activities that create a just transition away from fossil fuels, but then layering elements of connectivity, infrastructure development, ecosystem design, and policy so that it can scale and truly develop and deliver on the promises of a well-being economy, of a donut economy that serves our social needs, meets our social needs without going beyond planetary boundaries. And I'm going to turn it over now to Neil, who will talk more about what that's looking like, both globally and the United States. Neil, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Lovely to be here today with you all. I'm Neil McEnroy. I'm the global lead for community wealth building at the Democracy Collaborative, and I'm calling in here actually from the Shetland Islands, which are an archipelago of islands in the North Atlantic, who are actually advancing community wealth building in relation to the energy renewable sector here. So, but it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for all that, Sarah. And I think the beautiful thing about community wealth building is that it's rich in history, has a rich provenance, has strong theoretical and conceptual framework, but ultimately this is also deeply practical. And we talk in community wealth building about the 5 pillars of community wealth building, and these are intentional strategies and activities that one can pursue that starts to turn the dial on the wealth inequality and the issues that the economy is creating within our society and our environment. And so we have these intentional strategies. We have around, across these 5 pillars, there is around 50 or 60 different elements that make up these separate pillars. Fair work. What we're talking about here is progressive labour market policies, a good wage for a good day's work, good terms and condition, living wage. These are the things that are intentional activities, actions, strategies that you can start to develop as part of a community wealth building approach. Locally rooted finance. We need a financial system, an ecosystem that truly nurtures our people and our communities, that the wealth is not extracted. So we're looking at community development finance initiatives, progressive inward investment policies, philanthropic capital, the use of pension funds that support local ingenuity, creativity, and imagination, and making sure that that wealth is has a circular pattern within our economies. Just use of land and property, huge source of wealth. Would be an interest in community land trusts, community ownership, shared equity housing. We're interested in ways by which we make that wealth of our land and property circular in terms of who it benefits. Progressive procurement, the role of big, large anchor organisations in localities like hospitals, local city councils, municipalities, colleges. Where are they spending their money? Are they spending it to support local enterprises, local Black enterprises, cooperatives, employee-owned firms? And finally, but most importantly, I think, of all of these pillars, is we need to have more economic democracy. The reason we have the problem in our economy is there's too little control and too little say in what happens in the economy. We need to have more inclusive and democratic enterprises, social enterprises, co-ops, employee-owned firms. This all gives us, as citizens, as people, a genuine stake in the economy and how it operates and who it operates for. Next slide, please, Tadian. Now, in this intentional strategies we have for community wealth building, we talk about 3 legs to the stool. This is a movement, we believe, well, not believe, it is. And what we seek to do in community wealth building is grow 3 legs to the stool. We need practice. We need things to happen on the ground, and we'll hear some great examples coming up in a moment from our colleagues on this call. We need to start doing things. Hopefully all of those aspects I just mentioned on the pillars, or it could just be one. It may just be procurement. It may just be good labour market policies. But we need to get practice going, to show intel. But we also need networks and movement building. We need activists. We need all of you in this call to get behind this movement, to say, yes, we need change. We can change the economy. We can address the racial wealth gap. We can deal with climate crisis. So we need to build networks and movements. And in this, we do have at TDC our practitioner network, as well as a academic and research network. And we're looking to grow and strengthen those networks, funding permitted, as we move forward. And we also, of course, we cannot ignore the policy and legislative context here. We need to have policies that support progressive procurement, that support fair work, that allow a diverse and plural forms of finance. We need to advance. So all of these three legs are important in building community wealth building. Next one, Tadian. And globally, where my work is predominantly focused, there is a surprisingly huge amount of global interest and work already taking place. Sarah alluded to it when she talked about the UK, but the Preston model was the first manifestation outside of the USA of a full cream, as we call it, community wealth building approach across the 5 pillars. It's in Lancashire in England, and the Preston model has now been going for about 10 years. On the top left-hand corner there, we see, this is Scotland, where I'm actually from. We now have a Minister for Community Wealth, and we have a number of localities across Scotland advancing community wealth building. And importantly, it's also a national economic strategy. So this is a strategic strategy as well as an action-focused one in Scotland. We're seeing pickup in Australia. Recently, the publication at the bottom left was from New Zealand. 2 weeks ago, I was in South Korea. We have a range of localities who are picking up on CWB. That there on the top right in your screen is from Amsterdam, a world city in the Netherlands, and one of the large neighbourhoods of Amsterdam are very much picking up on this community wealth building theme, adopting all of the type of pillars that I talked about earlier as intentional strategies. Next one, please, Tadian. And finally, but not least, we obviously have the home, if you like, of community wealth building was the United States, and there is a growing network on a range of locations picking up on CWB. All of those organizations on the right-hand side and many more are part of our practitioner network. And many of these areas are either adopting all of the 5 pillars, three of the 5 pillars, or 4, some combination, but they're all on this journey. They're all advancing practice in some way. They're all starting to build a movement in networks, and they're all starting to make changes to policy and the wider context to the success of community wealth building. And just finally, before I finish and pass back to Tadian, we are definitely at the end of the beginning of community wealth building. The concept is proven. The practice is starting to grow. We now need to start growing it exponentially. And that requires all of us as a community to share, to learn from each other, and to mutually push on. We also need more funding, more support to advance community wealth building, both from a TDC point of view, but also all these organizations I talked about also need funding and nourishment. So I'll finish now, pass back to Tadian. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the show, as I surely will. Tadian.
Thank you, Neil. And thank you, Sarah, as well, for that national but also global perspective and landscape around community wealth building as a whole. Just to uplift one of the points that Neil just mentioned, that this is movement work, right? And movement work is only done by the collective. It is done by the we, not the I's. So to see what that looks like in practice, we have 2 practitioners on our call today, Kim, Jessica, and Charlie, who's going to share the scope and landscape from their respective communities. So here on your screen, you'll see our three speakers or facilitators here, if you will, in the order in which they'll be speaking. So first up, we'll have Kim giving some context from Kindred Spirits. I know she'll talk a little bit more about that. I had to catch myself there. And she serves as the Vice President of Strategy and Impact. So she'll kind of lay the landscape of some things they've been doing, respectively in Atlanta and Georgia, but also some of the growth efforts they're doing as an organization as a whole. So Kim, I'll turn it over to you and pull your presentation up at this time.
Thank you, Tadian. This is what I like to call speed dating. So we're going to go through and talk. I'll talk about Atlanta in the context of Atlanta while Tadian pulls up the deck. All right. Thank you. And just to reiterate, the name of our organization is called Kindred Futures. We're formerly known as the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative. That context is important because a lot of folks know our work. We recently went through a rebrand. Let me start my timer. We are a catalytic nonprofit of practitioners, advocates, investors that exist to retool policies and practices to build the wealth of Black people who make up the majority of those with zero or negative net worth. Our mission remains the same. So our vision is that all Black people have an opportunity to thrive in just and inclusive economies. And so we are a race explicit organization, not race exclusive, but we center the experiences of Black folks to build Black wealth. We also serve as an intermediary. Tadian, you can go to the next slide. We also serve as an intermediary. We act as a bridge, just for context. We pay particular attention to how resources are allocated, what support is needed on the ground to ensure that the lens of decision-making is rooted in community. We also establish relationships that are 10 feet deep versus 10 foot wide. 10 feet wide. So just thinking about the relationships and how important they are. We also advocate and influence through the use of data and the policy analysis and research. And so we operate in the spirit of love, but we keep centered in that love accountability. So you see our work is organized around build, lead, and invest. I lead our build work, which is really organized around coalition, support building, and movement building in our work. So you can go to the next slide. The next slide really talks about the race explicit lens that we have. We are focused on building Black wealth. And so the traditional metrics, which are rooted in white standards, overlook a lot of times the historical injustices faced by many Black communities. And so we advocate for a much more holistic approach when we talk about wealth building. Traditionally, is assets minus liabilities, and that equals your wealth. We actually leverage the definition of community wealth building. We utilize that lens to include a race explicit lens to define Black community wealth as a practice and outcome for how we are building collective assets of Black people, spaces, and experience. You can go to the next slide. So the next two slides really are about the context of place and how we are thinking and utilizing community wealth building. So earlier we talked about those 5 stools. I kind of walked through some of the work that we're doing in that space, but also some of the things, within the context of a community of practice, some of the challenges that we have. And so while Atlanta is where we are planted, the South is where we will continue to build momentum to prioritize economic opportunities, not just for Atlantans, but for 2 million Black households across the South with zero negative net worth across about 10, 11 states in the South. You can go to the next. So that's our North Star, so you know what we're working towards. So our focus on Black Southern communities is really intentional due to the region's complex history of policies and economics that underpin racial and economic injustices. So you can see from the slide, the metrics, we always lead with data. Community wealth building is an essential tool and approach for fostering resilience, and I'll get into a little bit of a detail of what that looks like, and equity in the South, right? And so I think a really good example of that is because the South has such a long history of economic exclusion, specifically around racial lines that have left many folks, people of color with fewer assets and economic mobility. Approaches and tactics like community wealth building really help kind of shift wealth building tactics and approaches to build economic power that are rooted in community. So strategies like ownership models, the use of community land trusts, cooperative enterprises, they all help to ensure that wealth generated within communities actually stays and creates the foundation for long-term inclusive prosperity. And so we actually have a site visit tomorrow for the support of Black-owned cooperatives, and just to kind of illustrate and show how that work is really making a difference here in Georgia. The next slide. So the other piece that how we think about building wealth, which is all important to how we utilize community wealth building, is that we use an ecological model. We think about the interconnectedness of the systems that Black folks are kind of navigating to reach wealth outcomes, right? We also think about data-driven policy. So earlier we talked about the structural determinants, or kind of the barriers that are in place that prevent Black folks from building wealth. And so this just gives you a construct of the structural determinants of Black wealth that we have laid out in a framework to look at through the lens of community wealth building. And I'll get into that in the next couple of slides. Next slide. So the context of place is really important. So you always have to think about local motivations and infrastructure, right? And so Atlanta has such an enduring reputation, right? When you think about it as the Black center of political power, it has a large professional Black class, but still within that, we're also home to many well-known Black educational institutions when you think about the population of Black middle class. And so, given that we still have the highest income inequality in the nation, right? Which on the surface is an issue. It's a paradox, right? Given the history of Atlanta, one of the metrics in the city of Atlanta that we recently published was that the wealth of white households in Atlanta is 46 times that of Black households, right? And that's a metric that says we have to do something different. And Atlanta really has this mixture of, economic inequalities, but it also has a richness of collaboration and movement building. Next slide. So this is really the meat of the work of what we've been doing in this space, but also understanding that that context helps kind of move and accelerate the work that we're doing. So these are organized around the 5 pillars: inclusive and democratic enterprises, right? So at Kindred Futures, we're focused on investing in supporting shared ownership models such as worker-owner cooperatives, right? Our role in that place, so just thinking the important role that an organization plays is both an investor, a convener, but also the sharing of learnings within the field. We have a whole policy and research institute that kind of helps facilitate those learnings and produces papers and research reports towards that end. Land use, land and property use is really important. So we're working on projects like the Beltline initiatives by the Southern Poverty Law Center. When you think about equitable development, right? So the Beltline, for most folks, know that it's a 22-mile loop, right? So our role in that place, in that project, is around data analysis and understanding trends in small business, but also recommendations on practices, doing a policy audit. All of those things help accelerate and implement strategies that create more equitable practices in land and property use. And then I'll just quickly go through progressive procurement. That's another area in fair work. So we're doing work to support the ecosystem by supporting business support organizations. We also recently got funded to develop a worker center to drive fair work and procurement practices here in Georgia. So just thinking as an investor, a strategic partner, how do we help support and build out progressive procurement and fair work in the context of an organization. And those are some examples of how we've been able to do that. Next slide. So the role of organizations and institutions are important for that. We do a lot of partnership development across institutions. They are important in terms of scaling, community partnerships, and really helping to support mission-aligned projects that really reach these 5 pillars that we're working on. Next slide. So conclusion, this is my last slide. I have a couple of minutes. So there's lots of work happening around these 5 pillars that we're helping to facilitate and broker partnerships around. Some of the challenges that we still see that is not necessarily isolated to a place like Atlanta are things like policy and regulatory barriers, right? So you think about the existing policy environment, you have to think about them being conducive to things like ownership model, right? Or tax and licensing or zoning restrictions when you think about that, or lack of awareness around and technical support if you are thinking about shared ownership models. And then lastly, fragmented support ecosystem also makes sometimes the work very difficult. But across all of those challenges and barriers, we're still making strides in this work, and just really excited to share or answer any questions related to that. I can't believe I did it. It was like 10 minutes.
You were like right on it, Kim.
Thank
Thank
y'all.
you. The pressure is on for our next 2 speakers and panelists. But thank you, Kim, for really giving the overview of the work that you're doing at Kindred Futures and how you're elevating the landscape of community wealth building respective to place. So next we're going to go to Charlie with We Power. So Charlie, I'll pull your slides up at this time if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and get started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Charlie Cooksey. I'm based in St. Louis, and I am the founder and CEO of We Power. And before I get started, I just want to say it's so awesome to be around all the folks that I've been fangirling about for years. And We Power has been a learner and fan of community wealth building for a few years. And now we're finally starting to make the transition towards operationalizing it in St. Louis. So We Power, we're about 6 years old, and we exist to advance 3 key strategies, all geared towards activating community power to transform our social systems. So one way we do that is bringing together everyday people to reimagine a specific system and then publishing a playbook that is both community informed and research based. Then we are focused on developing as many people's capacity to be those agents of change. And then lastly, providing support as those folks are leading campaigns, coalitions, and projects to bring those playbooks to life. So we've done that to advance 2 social systems being transformed. So we can go to the next slide. In service of our vision, which is that systems are accountable to communities who are powerful, and especially prioritizing those communities that have been historically oppressed and marginalized, and really shifting systems to support people's freedom, agency, well-being, and joy. And we can go to the next slide. So those 2 social systems we're working to shift in service of that vision right now is our childcare system and our economic system. So we want to get to a day where as many children as possible in our region have access to high quality seats in the early childhood space, ages 0 through 5. Right now, only 19% of children living in poverty have a seat. And then we want to get to a day where the racial wealth gap is closing significantly. So national data, I think we've all seen, but white median wealth is about 116K compared to Black and Latinx median wealth, which is 2K or less. We can go to the next slide. Just a snapshot of some of our impact to date. Through our leadership development and support work, we have 4 change makers or alumni who are serving as elected leaders and have pledged support for our early childhood and community wealth building priorities. We have over 400 alumni who have learned the fundamentals of organizing, policy design, and how to run for office. We've supported over 100 businesses, deployed about $1 million in capital from our fund and grants program and loans program, and won almost $20 million in public funding for early childhood education. We can go to the next slide. So that leads us to where we are right now. We knew that the way that we were doing our work with entrepreneurs was important, but not sufficient if we truly wanted to make a dent in closing the racial wealth gap. So the first half of this year, after a lot of listening and learning over the past few years, we embarked upon a community design process to reimagine St. Louis's economy. We can go to the next slide. So some data specific to St. Louis, 21% of households in our region have either a zero or negative wealth, meaning they have no assets. And then when you look at the ability for families in the region to meet their basic needs and afford everyday expenses, if you look at Black households, over 80% do not bring in enough income. And then if you look at Hispanic and Latinx households, about 70% do not bring in enough income. We can go to the next slide. Additionally, we know that a lot of the ways we try to solve for our economic issues are informed by harmful or false mental models. This idea of individualism and meritocracy, that if you work hard, you'll get wealthy. This idea of consumerism and this growing trend of that we can buy Black our way to wealth. And that is not to say we shouldn't buy Black, but buying Black is not sufficient given the centuries of issues that have led to this gap. And then lastly, we work to disrupt this idea that the bigger is the better. We can go to the next slide. So specific to St. Louis, there are a few few conditions that are really impacting what inspired us to make this transition to community wealth building and what is going to call on us to lean in even more. One is there's unprecedented funding that is coming to the region. So we have about $750 million that came through a RAM settlement when the Rams football team decided to leave and go to LA. There's federal funds that are coming into the region. We have a new round of actors and leaders in the economic development space. They all developed plans and strategies, but close to none of them are centering policy and systems change and are really laying into some of those more traditional practices around economic development. Additionally, our region is notorious for fragmentation. We're one of the few regions in the country where the city is separate from the county. In the county, we have 88 municipal governments, nearly 50 police departments, and over 23 school districts for a population of less than 1 million folks. The opportunity, however, is we have a robust and growing network of anchor institutions that are aligning, and we also see pockets of community wealth building happening in the region that show an appetite for doing this at an even larger scale. We can go to the next slide. So a quick snapshot of our numbers in terms of our design process. We had 80 folks apply. We selected 14 design fellows from our community. We had almost 100 folks sign up to join different work groups, 16 design council members, basically advisory board of really diverse folks ranging from anchor institutions and foundation leaders to grassroots movement leaders and elected officials. We engaged with 30 subject matter experts from across the globe and had 1,000+ community engagements. And our design fellows and solution team members put in about 2,000 hours of design work over about 4 months. You can go to the next slide. So we had our design fellows who facilitated those design days. We had solution team members who participated in those different design days. We had our design council, our advisory board really pushing us to strengthen the process, and the design team running the day-to-day operations in between those design days. Next slide. This is just a picture of our amazing design fellows who facilitated the process. Next slide. And then this is a snapshot of some of our solution team members who came together every month for 8 hours at a time to reimagine our local economy. Next slide. So in that process, we were very emergent and open, but we had one rule that we were going to stick to using community wealth building as our framework. We can go to the next slide. So in terms of the process, pre-2024, we did a lot of listening to surface community vision and values and a lot of learning from community wealth building leaders across the country and globe, including many of you here on this call. Design Day 1 was really holding space for folks to understand and also define the problems they wanted to solve for. Design Day 2 was learning from subject matter experts and then beginning to throw as many ideas on a wall as possible. Design Day 3 was prioritizing which of these solutions actually have traction and can yield impact. And and then we started to refine our theory of change around community wealth building. And then design day 4 is where we tied all the loose ends, finalized our theory of change and solutions, and then start to prioritize of all these solutions that will be reflected in our playbook, which one should we prioritize in phase 1. And then the rest of this year, we've been doing action planning so we can gear up for publishing this playbook at the top of next year. Next slide. So our vision is really centered around this idea that basically everyone has the right to have their basic needs met and to be well, and the economy plays a critical role in that. Additionally, there's a big focus on shifting away from our fragmentation and divides and leaning into this collective commitment that we should all prosper. In terms of outcomes, we knew that one critical outcome is that we are a lot more effective at regional collaboration and coordination, that we needed to increase democracy and community power, that we needed to equitably distribute wealth and resources, and lastly, improve family and community well-being. Next slide. So here's some of our values in this reimagined economy: thriving neighborhoods, collective care and well-being, repair as a path to healing, and especially collective power and community ownership. We have 20 high-level solutions across 5 buckets: family well-being, capital and taxation, business and labor, ecosystem development, and land and property. And then that broke down, we can go to the next slide, into 70 sub-solutions. We kept trying to cut, and it was clear that we have a lot of solutions that are needed to address our regional economic harm. And so here's a snapshot of some of those sub-solutions. We have some around universal access to healthcare, around making housing a right of every family, providing reparations, pursuing a city-county merger, and also creating and financing the process of more worker-owned businesses being established and converting more existing businesses to become worker-owned. And as Kim and others mentioned, shifting procurement practices at anchor institutions to really be biased towards community wealth building. So what's next? So starting in 2025 is when we begin the process of operationalizing the playbook and really making this transition to community wealth building. So we have 4 bodies of work. One is public awareness around what is community wealth building, why it matters. The second bucket is around coordination. So designing the right coordinating body and strategy so that there's a shared approach to community wealth building becoming a real thing in our region. And then pilots. So we are starting with piloting one of those recommendations in the playbook around supporting and financing worker ownership. And then lastly, policy change. So communities that focus on meeting people's basic needs. So we're starting with local ballot measures to win new funding streams for childcare, and then also the research and design to stand up a paid family leave campaign at the state level. And I will wrap up with a quote from one of my favorite articles called "Why Social Movements Need the Radical Imagination." And it says, "The radical imagination is not just about dreaming of different futures. It's about bringing those possibilities back from the future to work on the present, to inspire action and new forms of solidarity today." Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. I love that quote there. The radical imagination is not just about dreaming of different futures. It's about bringing those possibilities back from the future to work on the present, to inspire action and new forms of solidarity today. Yeah, thank you all for it. I'm kidding. That would have been a great closer. I love that quote so much. I actually want to take that into practice. Thank you, Charlie. So we have one more amazing presentation today from some amazing work happening in Colorado. We have Jessica here to share that. So Jessica, I will pull your presentation up if you'd like to introduce yourself at this time and take over.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I will set my timer because it's community wealth building and I can talk about it all day. I'm Jessica Holguin. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Community Wealth Building in Metro Denver. A little bit about community wealth building. We initially started, the strategy initially started back in 2013. There was a group of people who realized that our economy was very strong, and yet it was not benefiting those who were most vulnerable. And so this group of organization and community leaders got together and started to figure out how to do economic development in a different way, recognizing that the traditional efforts have not only not worked, but they were actually working against our communities. And so they visited the evergreen cooperatives and got a pretty good idea as to what it could look like. If we can go to the next slide, please. And actually we can go 2 slides. So you see, in 2013, we were starting to see a lot of investment in neighborhoods that had traditionally been red line neighborhoods. And so Black and brown neighborhoods all of a sudden getting an influx of capital. And the image that you see here was from a neighborhood where all of a sudden the beauty of every single one of our neighborhoods in low-income communities was shifting, and was shifting in a way that was not only not benefiting our communities, it was involuntarily displacing people because of gentrification. And it was happening at an alarming rate. At that time, back in 2013, Colorado's minimum wage was just $7.78, $7.78. And yet, by then, the average price of a home was about $310,000. And so we knew that development was happening and it wasn't necessarily benefiting our communities. And so we started to see that housing continue to increase. I think that year itself, housing or home values increased at about 14% just over the year. And so this rapid growth and the lack of intentional attention to our communities, unfortunately left us feeling like there was a significant gap. 2016, the group organized a conference, and there were a couple of people from foundations that realized that something had to happen. And so in 2017, they hired me to conduct community engagement. And so I was able to connect with almost 400 community members, business owners, elected officials, organizational leaders, to try to figure out where the gaps were. At that time, there were a lot of organizations doing business development, but there was still a gap. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. One of the things that we saw was that Colorado had, by all definition, a very strong economy. In 2021, we had a $371 billion economy, and yet 17.2% of that total income went to the top 1% of households in Colorado. And so when you talk about the inequity in the labor and the value that our communities were seeing, it was all going to wealthy populations. By 2021, our home prices had increased. The average home price was about $553,000, almost $554,000. And it became incredibly challenging for our communities to make ends meet. And one of the things that we recognize is that not only was our economy not working for all, but it was actually starting to hurt everybody. And I think the recognition that community wealth building was adopted as the approach because we recognize that even though it's our low-income communities, it's our communities of color that are dealing with the negative consequences, ultimately everybody in our state will be impacted. And we're seeing some of that impact now with labor shortages, with people not being able to stay in communities and actually being able to live and work here. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. Unfortunately, our traditional solutions have been focused on seemingly disparate problems, finding short-term solutions when what we knew we needed were systems level solutions. It was like trying to put a hold over the dam and just putting our fingers in the holes to stop the water. When in reality, we're upholding the same structures that got our communities to be here in the first place. And so we knew that we needed to shift from the system to, instead of upholding the system and continue to put Band-Aids over the problem, that we needed to transform the system completely. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. So Center for Community Wealth Building was born out of those 400 conversations. And our mission is simple: to transform our economic systems to close the racial wealth gap. Easier said than done. We seek to foster collective power by advancing community and employee ownership, leveraging the economic engines of anchor institutions, and strengthening small businesses in historically excluded communities. Our vision is we envision self-determined communities free from racism and rooted in economic democracy, dignity, and joy. Back in 2017, when we started, we were unapologetically about racial equity first and foremost. We knew that an economic system that didn't focus racial equity would be a system that would continue to perpetuate the same problems that we started with to begin with. I'll be honest, in 2017, I was told that I was radical for trying to do this. And yet, having been, as a woman of color, having been in these conversations, I felt like I couldn't do it any other way. There's no way I would be able to mobilize communities in ways that made sense. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we ended up defining 3 strategies, and they are strengthening entrepreneurs of color, democratizing ownership through worker cooperatives through employee ownership, and engaging place-based institutions, hospitals, universities, municipalities, and identifying ways in which they can procure differently, invest differently, and hire differently to ensure that they are actually supporting the community outcomes that we want to see. So if we can go to the next slide, please. In terms of our approach, we were also very unique. I come from a community organizing background, so I wanted to start with communities at the grassroots level, working to ensure that the solutions that we're going to be co-creating could actually benefit our communities. I also recognized that unfortunately, our ecosystem was very segmented. And so working in siloed was not going to help us get to the level of change that we needed to see. But ultimately, our work is at the systems level. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. One of the really exciting opportunities was building a Shop by POC. During the pandemic, there were a lot of institutions that said, they were quick to publish their Black Lives Matter statements. And we said, that's great. And that's step 1. How are you shifting your procurement policies to ensure that you're actually supporting businesses owned by people of color? And our institution said, well, we want to, but it's really hard to find them. On the flip side, we were meeting with businesses and they just said they desperately needed connection to markets. And so we're like, here's the supply and here's the demand. Why isn't somebody putting this together? Nobody would do it. And so finally, I ended up taking on the challenge, but I did it by bringing all technical assistance providers, business entities that were supporting, that wanted to see businesses thrive, and said, are we going to do this together? So we ended up co-developing Shop by POC. We can go to the next slide, please. To make sure that we had an opportunity to co-create something and start to streamline some of the services. And so you'll see some of our partners and some of our institutions that said this matters to us, and we're adopting shopbypoc.com as a platform to identify businesses to utilize. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And yet our work is ultimately focused on systems level, ensuring that the policies in our institutions and even our ordinance and state policies reflect the communities and actually support the communities that we want to see. So if you can go to the next slide, please. And so when we think about our work, I wanted to share quickly CCWB in action, because it seems like it's different strategies, but they work in alignment. And so just a couple of weeks ago, we hosted our Eat Local Food event, where we brought community members, community caterers to present to almost 80 institutions that were ready to purchase, that already purchased food for meetings, for events, and they were ready to connect with these entrepreneurs. It was amazing to see the entrepreneurs be able to share their story. And then it became about the personal relationship, where somebody from a hospital really wanted to build a connection with Maria, because all of a sudden it becomes about Maria's well-being. It becomes about our community's well-being. And so we're looking to bridge the racial wealth gap by forging these partnerships between local people of color owned businesses and strengthening their operations so they can successfully do business with these large institutions. We're also working with the large institutions to make sure that we have the opportunity to ensure that it's not just a few businesses that benefit, but truly that all businesses benefit. So if we can go to the next slide. So to conclude, I just wanted to say that this is a movement, and it's up to every single one of us to make it happen. We cannot wait for institutions or for our governments to catch up. They will eventually, and we will push them to catch up. But the reality is that every single one of us has the opportunity to do something to ensure that our dollars stay in our communities, that our dollars circulate in our communities. And so I challenge you to think about how you're spending your money to ensure that it's actually supporting the communities that you want to see. And thank you for allowing me to be here.
Thank you, Jessica. Wow, you all did great timing. I didn't have to come in and be the bad guy here. So thank you all for doing that so well in your 10-minute time slot. But really, so we can get to the meat of this conversation. The hope of this webinar was not just to make it one way, but to make it a two-way street that you all can also answer the questions that you may have central to this work of community wealth building. One of the things we wanted to be intentional about is make this space available and accessible for anybody across the spectrum of understanding and implementation around community wealth building. So some people here are here learning of what CWB is for the first time and hoping to implement practices in their community. And there are some of those who may have been in this work for a long time. But regardless of where you may be across that spectrum, we want to hear from you. So now it's an opportunity for us to kind of go into the moderated Q&A portion of our event for today. So we're going to start to pull some questions from the Q&A section. So for those who may be on a device where you can do that, there should be a Q&A button on your screen where you can submit questions, and we'll try to pull a couple of those out so that we can go into some Q&A with our panelists, but also our TDC team can jump in where necessary as well. All right, so 1 second while I pull those questions up. All right, so I'm gonna take this one just from a TDC perspective as we get started. Someone asked about that list of the 50 to 60 elements across the 5 pillars that Neil mentioned earlier. So you can navigate our website, which is democracycollaborative.org. And now, Rudy, if you don't mind, can we repost the link to that in the chat as I'm speaking about it? But on the website, you can start to access some of those elements. We are creating documents that you all can access to put into practice in your respective places around each element in particular. So those are still being built out in real time, but a lot of those are already accessible to U.S. practitioners or researchers or officials, elected officials in your communities to reference. So again, that was just put back into the chat again. You can navigate that on our website. Again, that is the democracycollaborative.org. All right, so I'm gonna pull a couple questions here. We have some information here, and I want to get here. We have a question from Grace, and now Rudy, I'll pass this to either you or Neil. Neil, feel free to jump in as well. Question around what additional research could be provided to the CWB movement and helpful for continuing to advance that work at a local but also global level as well. Neil and now Rudy, do you want to take that one?
I'll come in, and that's okay, Tadian. It's a very, very good question, and it's one that we are noodling over in our global academic and research network for CWB that we have. And the types of things we're grappling with is, how do you accelerate community wealth building? Where does it go fast? Where does it go slow? What are the impediments and blocks? What are the spending and patterns in a place? There's a numerous amount of research areas to explore, and all partly underexplored. We also need some good applied policy research on this. What would take really good policy that advanced community land trusts, or really good policies that advance the types of things our colleagues have been talking about? So there's a range of stuff that we're discussing as part of that network, and for the questioner, just keep your eyes posted on that when we start emitting more things from that network. Great question, thank you.
I would just add on to that as folks have mentioned consistently, a big component of community wealth building is localizing our economy and the ownership of the economy at the local level. And so with that, what I would love to see is like localizing of the data and it being readily and consistently updated. So like, for example, right now, we don't have accessible and consistent data on the racial wealth gap specific to St. Louis. And so part of our work is not just doing the work, but we need to measure it to hold ourselves accountable, to learn, to iterate. And so I think a lot of the data that we track and report at the national level, if we could localize that and do so consistently, it would help us a lot with building awareness to folks at the local level that their current practices aren't working, and to support folks like us on this call to measure our true progress towards that shift.
Yeah.
That's
Kim, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. You know, the way our organization is structured is that we have a policy and research institute, which makes my work actually much easier because we have a participatory lens, which we are doing interviews and just kind of understanding the experiences that residents are having navigating our economy. So you're right, Charlie, there has to be more efforts around that. We're expanding our Beloved Economies research report across the South, just FYI. But there's opportunities to partner on that. This is where the collective, I think, is an important lever.
Yeah, thank you for opening that up, Kim. I'm actually going to use that to transition into two questions that we have here, kind of both written in the same way. And this is more so for our panelists, if you don't mind expanding upon this. So let's talk about narrative a bit, right? Data plays a huge part in helping us to direct, but also curate and craft, but also affirm, right, our narrative and the why behind our what. Question here: how can we counter the right wing or like extremists who critique CWB as a communist and left-wing critics that critique CWB as insufficiently state-owned? Is there something here that can span ideologies? And just to kind of go into that a bit further, in the field of economic development, CWB is often viewed as just a tactic or strategy. How can we shift this perspective to position CWB as a foundational approach for driving inclusive growth and building resilience, making it an essential element in strengthening the competitive landscape found in the United States?
I can tackle a little bit of the first one because Colorado, even though it's a blue state, it's still a purple state in some ways. And yet, when you talk about opportunity for all, there's no side to that. I would venture to guess that everyone can say that all we want is opportunity. And so when we build the systems for the most vulnerable, everyone will benefit. And so even if we are focused on entrepreneurs of color, we still serve everyone. And so we've seen that all small businesses benefit from the policies. One of the things that I'm very mindful is that language matters. And so in some spaces, we say we're democratizing ownership through worker cooperatives. In other spaces, we say we're democratizing capitalism. And in essence, it's the same thing. We want to make sure that the workers who are creating the value are the ones who benefit from it. I don't care what side of the spectrum, I don't care where they're coming from. We want to make sure that they have everything they need. And if that's what it takes, calling it something slightly different, the reality is that we want those dollars to stay in our communities. So I'll do that.
I'll just add to it. I know so there's this tap dance that's happening around race and race explicit work. And I want to acknowledge that because I think on the surface, people feel like just generally like it's more of a moral issue. But in fact, it's really an economic issue. And we should always center it when we're talking about you know, the boat that rises all tides, when you're focused on a particular group or population, particularly Black people and Black people of color, it really helps advance our economy at the end of the day. And I think we have to keep that front and center. The other thing I'll say around, I think this bridge between ideology, I think there has to also be kind of strategies to help that. So when you think about right wing or left wing, right, you have to emphasize, particularly for those that don't necessarily believe in community wealth building, that you have to stress like local control, the decentralization of economic power, which very much aligns to kind of self-reliance, personal responsibility, and entrepreneurship. So I think there are ways to bridge the gap. I think we just have to do more and have more efforts around narrative that emphasizes local control, that highlights sustainability and inclusive growth, and also talk about it from a pragmatic success, like when you think about how to talk about it across and bridge ideologies.
Yeah, and I'll quickly build on that. This I think that what we're experiencing is giving language, shared language, to a model that has always been true for everyday people, for indigenous communities, for Black communities, for brown communities. The way that marginalized folks have survived in this country and beyond has been through community ownership, shared ownership, democracy. And now I think we're finally getting to a point where we can socialize what we know has been true in community since before I was ever a concept as a person who's on this earth right now, but way before my parents existed as well. But to me, a lot of this work is, and when we did our listing to ask folks about their visions and values, this is before we even did a public awareness around what community wealth building was. They surfaced it as a priority for them. They said they wanted their community to share resources, to share dollars, to share land. And so I do think it's inherent in everyday people's desires and aspirations, and it's our responsibility to leverage our resources to operationalize it, and also to give to amplify what we're hearing from community. A lot of this work is about redefining what wealth is, and that definition of wealth is that people are well, they don't just have enough money in the bank. So a lot of, I think, our work is public awareness and amplification of what we hear being community's values.
Just going briefly, if I may, Tadian, and about the ideology, I think in my experience globally, community wealth building is for all places, because the battle here is between authoritarianism, concentration of wealth and power, versus democracy and a fair share for all. And so that your small business owner who's getting taken over by large global corporates, your spatially bound business who sees distant shareholders taking over owning some of their firm. This is the battle lines. This is not traditional left and right. This is authoritarianism, concentration of wealth and power, versus a democracy that makes better decisions and creates a fairer, more decent economy. So I think we've got a changing battle lines, if you like.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you added that, Neil. And Kim, talked about the importance of bringing economics into this conversation. And that kind of flows into a next question here. Sarah, if I can turn it to you for a response here, if you don't mind. Talk about economic transformation. So earlier, Sarah, during your presentation, and these are comments from Brian, you really talked about that income and wealth and how we can make that distribution more democratic, which is very necessary for the growth of our community and advancing community wealth building. However, that big barrier that you spoke about is the existing top-heavy distribution of wealth that we all experience and know exists around us each and every day. Sarah, how do we most effectively redistribute the existing wealth and think about that in a new way, particularly from the lens of community wealth building as an approach?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Thank you for that, Brian, and thanks for bringing that to the discussion, Tadian. Community wealth building is about pre-distribution. It is about building new structures that distribute and share our resources in more equitable ways from the beginning, rather than doing that after the effect. But and so we do need to do that. We absolutely need to do that. We need to construct new institutions and new forms to distribute that wealth in equitable ways so that this doesn't happen anymore. But it is true that in order to do that better, we need to be able to redistribute away from the agglomerated wealth that we already have, right? So we have to be able to do both is the short and I think challenging response to that, right? We need to be able to be doing both at the same time. So we do have to do that redistribution, and of course that will require not just what we can do locally. That has to be something that we can do at different levels within our policy and legislative frameworks, right? So, and ultimately federally, and of course globally, there needs to be some political action around that. But that doesn't mean we can't do anything about that on our own. And in many ways, as about these strategies, for example, procurement is one way that we can use existing wealth flows, right? So that are coming from sort of agglomerated existing wealth to help build up these new pre-distributive institutions. So using what we already have in ways that do begin to alter that unequal balance that we already have in our economies. And progressive procurement is one of those, but also many different new financial instruments that we're developing and financial forms can also work to redistribute that wealth in a way that we can use it to help build these pre-distributive forms. I'm sure others have more concrete examples of that, but we need to be able to be doing both at the same time.
Yeah, and I'll take it from there, Sarah, to a kind of a next leading question, which I'll feel free to answer here. So when we talk about that ownership, is the emphasis in community wealth building on ownership at the community level, kind of more collective and broad, or does it also include wealth built by and for community members, families, kind of right on the ground, local people having shared ownership at the individual level as well? Any thoughts around that?
This is Kim. I'll share in terms of what I've seen. Neil, did you want to?
Oh, please, Kim, you go. You go.
I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and. In the work that we are trying to support, it is for local everyday folks, right? Here in Atlanta, we have mixed use development, which is the Guild, right? It's for historically based residents that have lived there, right? That want to contribute and be a part of building wealth in a development that is actually in the process of being built, right? There are also worker owner cooperatives where everyday folks like the Come Up Project in Georgia are working with young people to build a brand, right? But those young people also can tap into and have ownership of that company and build wealth and assets over time. So my comment is it's both.
I would second that too. For us, it's both as well. We wanted to make sure that we're building the system that we want to see, but it's elitist to only think about the future, right? When our people are having to figure out how to make ends meet by the end of the month. And so we wanted to make sure that we're capitalizing on the opportunity without sacrificing our communities right now.
I mean, across the world, the problem here is a concentration of wealth. 10% of Americans own 60% of wealth. What we need here is to have many more plural forms of ownership where us people have more of a genuine stake. And that includes, community ownership, individual ownership, cooperative ownership, municipal ownership, shared ownership, employee ownership. We need to democratize our economy in a broad way, and that needs to be plural, because at the moment it's far too singular. As Sarah said, with the 5 richest men own the same amount of wealth as half the population of the world. This is an exercise in plurality, in collectivizing, in rallying us all as human social beings together to take more control of the economy.
Yeah, and I think the idea here is that the collective approach to our economy, a cooperative approach, allows for more individuals to be okay. And so part of our work in theory is to disrupt the idea that we can individualize our way out of poverty and towards wealth, because the way that our current economy is designed relies on competition, and which means there are winners, very few winners, and a lot of losers when it comes to who has capital and resources. And so I don't think it's an attempt to say that we don't believe in individual wealth, but it is an attempt to say that through cooperative approaches and more collective and community-driven approaches, more individuals can build wealth, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that capital piece, Charlie, and I kind of want to take that into this section to try to answer a question or two in this section of finance and fair work if we can, and looking at capital as it relates to money. So looking at this question here, here's a question. According to the analysis offered by the community wealth building movement, what are the shortcomings and limitations of the current frameworks in social innovation and impact investment? And what are kind of some of the things in terms of challenges that you see in this work as it relates to advancing community wealth building from a social impact and social innovation perspective?
I'll jump in. It's a fantastic question. I think impact investing is too singular. It tends to focus on individual projects or programs and not enough on the across the 5 pillars like we have in community wealth building, the economic strategy, the wider systemic change. So I'd like to see a lot more impact investing that doesn't doesn't say the smaller project initiative is not important, but sees it as part of a suite of impact investment to have broader systemic change across a range of areas. And I think unless we achieve that, move beyond the singular project, we will never reach the scale and the amplification that's required to truly deal with some of these pernicious problems like climate crisis, racial wealth gap, and so forth.
Yeah.
I want to just add a little bit. I appreciate, Neil, what you kind of laid out in terms of project base. I think when we talk about impact investing, it is about like there's a value proposition that gets missed when you think about community wealth building. So in terms of like profits, right, over community priorities, like many impact investment, they prioritize market rate returns when you think about like how they're structured, which can pressure who they're funding to kind of adopt this kind of growth orientation. It's less about stewardship, right? The other thing is the time frame of it. When you think about the shorter time frames, they're looking for a return on investment. We always talk about what it's required to kind of build out the cooperative space or shared ownership models because of just how they're structured in terms of like, I'm missing a word, but like how they're governed, right? The governance structures of those and how you kind of build community, I think really makes a difference because you need time and you also need patient capital to be able to drive towards outcomes and build community. So there is a value that gets missed sometimes when you do have those types of investments, impact investing.
Yeah, I'm glad you uplifted the word time there as well, Kim, because that is a part of this work. And I want to use that to try to get us into one final question because of time here. But considering time and things that are kind of a longer work, right? A longer fight, if you will. Let's kind of talk about how this work and how you're intersecting that across a greener economy. So can the panelists, your respective places talk about how you're connecting the work and the impact that you're having within your respective place and how you're considering the environmental and sustainable practices within that scope of work as well?
So in our process of community design, we actually grapple with this a lot because we know a lot of the economic issues we experience is because of the ecological or ecological harm that has been done. And sorry, I'm in a hotel room. I think they're about to come in. Can you come back? Can you come back? Sorry. So we had a really big discussion around this idea of applying an environmental justice lens and also the need for an entire reimagination campaign of the climate in our economy, because we need to center and acknowledge the environment in how our economy is run, and we need a robust, clear set of strategies specific to climate change. So I would say it's a both and so we're trying to figure out how do we always apply that lens to the solutions we are advancing, and also name that there needs to be a well-resourced, acknowledged, and thoughtful process that is specific to the environment.
Kim or Jessica, any additional context there?
For us here in Denver, unfortunately, I grew up in the most polluted zip code in the entire US. And so for us, it's more than just the movement, it's about survival. And so we're finding ways to incorporate it into our strategies. For example, we're in the process of completing a feasibility study for a landscaping cooperative. And we want that to be, the workers want it to be a green landscaping cooperative, because they recognize that the impact is something that is felt it's not just theoretical, it's something that they're living with every single day as their children continue to grow with asthma and respiratory problems. And so to us, it's about survival. It's more about how do we transition, because we know that it's an expensive process and it requires very patient, non-extractive capital that may not be necessarily available for our communities. And so we're working with philanthropy to try to figure out how do we ensure that that our communities have the resources needed to make that transition.
The only thing I'll add to that, from the perspective of like the South and agriculture and green space, green jobs rather, is particularly of importance. The Southern economy is particularly vulnerable to climate change, right? Due to the reliance on like agriculture, energy and tourism. And so being able to support agriculture, cooperative farming. I know the Georgia Cooperative Development Center and other development centers are doing work in that space to transition some of that work to the green economy that's happening already, where solar energy and all that kind of stuff is actually happening here. So it's really important, but the context of place also drives what wealth building tactics and strategies work in that space. And so for the South, that's what it looks like.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica, Kim, and Charlie, for your response there. And we literally have tons of questions here that we do not have time to get to. And we'll try to think of a strategy of a way that we can maybe distribute some answers and responses to continue to guide you on your work beyond this space. But in the effort of being a good steward of your time and commitment today, first, on behalf of TDC, we want to thank you for being here and giving up time out of your day to really think about advancing the work of community wealth building. And I'm really reflected back to the amazing quote that Charlie shared. It is bringing future vision into the present, and we each have a role in doing that. And your presence here today demonstrates that. But on behalf of TDC, again, thank you for your time. We will make this recording available. So I'll be looking forward to us sending that out so you can rewatch that and share it with those in your networks and in your respective places. But also understanding that TDC is a resource. So we have a number of resources on our website, democracycollaborative.org, that we can assist in advancing your work in your community. So continue to think about that and reach out to us and think about how we could help in advancing that work in your respective places. Again, to Charlie, to Jessica, to Kim, thank you for the work that you're doing on the ground every single day. And thank you for giving up some of your time to be here to share with the practitioners and researchers, government officials all across hopefully the world here today as we had this webinar. So again, to the TDC team, Neil, Sarah, Narudi, thank you all for your work as well. We'll hang around a bit for any lingering kind of in the moment questions you all may have, and we'll try to respond to them. But again, thank you for your time. Feel free to reach out to us, and we hope you have an amazing rest of your day.
And thank you, Tadian, and thank you, Nehrudi, for stewarding this wonderful discussion.